Thanks for clicking enjoy the full story. March 11th, 2011, started like any other day. A crisp Friday morning in the small coastal town of Miyamae, northeast of Sendai. The chill of early spring lingered in the air, but there was a promise of warmth as the sun rose higher. I remember the hum of life around me, the chatter of my neighbors at the bus stop, the distant bell of the local high school, and the ever-present scent of the sea that carried a mix of salt and nostalgia. My name is Aiko Sato. I was 32 at the time, working as a preschool teacher at Akabano Kindergarten. The school was a modest building near the coast, surrounded by a playground that had seen better days but still brought endless laughter to the children. That morning, I had been running late, fumbling with my bicycle lock while juggling a bag of art supplies. Aiko-chan, you'll be late again, my neighbor Mrs. Takahashi called from her front porch, clutching her morning tea. Just another minute. I called back, forcing a smile. My mornings were often chaotic, but I loved my job too much to mind. The children I taught, little whirlwinds of energy and curiosity, were my world. When I finally arrived at the school, the day began in its usual way, a sing-along session, snack time, and a round of duck, goose that turned into pure chaos. I was in the middle of helping one of the kids, Hannah, fix her shoelace when I noticed the first sign. The building gave a faint groan, a subtle shudder that made the hanging mobiles sway. It wasn't uncommon to feel small tremors in Miyamae. This was Japan, after all. But something about this one felt different. I glanced at my co-teacher, Masato, who was busy organizing art supplies. He caught my eye and raised an eyebrow. Do you think it's another aftershock from last week? He asked, his voice steady but questioning. Maybe, I replied, though the unease in my chest said otherwise. By noon, the tremors had subsided, and life seemed to carry on as normal. Parents came to pick up their children for lunch, and I took the chance to grab a bento box from the corner store. I remember standing in line behind an elderly fisherman named Mr. Ogawa, who was recounting a story about a strange behavior in the local wildlife. The gulls, he said, scratching his chin. They've been acting strange. Flying inland, away from the sea. And the fish? Barely a catch all week? I nodded politely, but I didn't think much of it at the time. The real earthquake struck at 2:46 p.m. I was back at the school, overseeing nap time. The room was filled with the soft rustle of children shifting in their sleep and the occasional murmur of a dream. I was folding blankets when the first jolt hit, violent and unrelenting. The floor beneath me seemed to lurch, and the walls groaned like a living thing in pain. The children woke instantly, their sleepy confusion turning into terror as the shaking intensified. Under the tables! I shouted, my voice trembling but firm. Masato and I scrambled to guide the children, who were crying and clutching at us in panic. The room felt like it was coming apart, the bookshelves toppled, toys scattered, and the sound of shattering glass filled the air. I've lived through earthquakes before, but this one felt endless. Each second stretched into an eternity as the ground heaved and roared. When the shaking finally stopped, an eerie silence followed, broken only by the wails of frightened children. Is everyone okay? I asked, my voice hoarse. I did a quick head count. Thankfully, everyone was accounted for. Masato and I guided the children outside, away from the unstable building. The scene that greeted us was surreal. The playground was a mess of overturned equipment and cracked asphalt. In the distance, I could see plumes of smoke rising from the town. Aiko-san, Masato said, his face pale. This is bad. Really bad. I nodded, my mind racing. The tremor wasn't just local, I could feel it in my gut. This was something bigger. In the hours that followed, chaos unfolded. Parents arrived in droves, their faces etched with fear and relief as they collected their children. Cell service was down, and the only information we could get came from battery-powered radios. Reports started trickling in. This wasn't just an earthquake. It was one of the strongest in Japan's recorded history, and it had triggered a massive tsunami warning for the entire northeastern coast. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. Miyamae was dangerously close to the coast. The warning sirens began to blare around 4 p.m., their haunting wails cutting through the air. Evacuate to higher ground, the loudspeakers blared in an endless loop. Masato and I worked together to move the remaining children to a nearby evacuation center, a school perched on a hill overlooking the town. The climb was grueling, every step weighed down by the fear of what was to come. As we reached the safety of the hill, I turned to look back at Miyamae. The town that had been my home for over 3 decades was now a fragile, trembling thing, vulnerable to the approaching wave. By the time the tsunami arrived, night had fallen. From the hill, we watched in stunned silence as the ocean rose and surged inland, consuming everything in its path. Homes, shops, and streets disappeared beneath the relentless force of water. I clutched Masato's arm, my heart breaking for the lives being swept away. I can't believe this is happening, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the tsunami. Neither could I. The hours after the tsunami felt like an eternity. We were huddled in the gymnasium of the evacuation center, surrounded by dozens of families, some reunited, others anxiously scanning the crowd for loved ones who hadn't made it up the hill in time. I sat on the cold floor with a blanket wrapped around me, my mind racing as I tried to process everything. Around me, children cried softly, parents whispered reassurances, and volunteers bustled about, distributing bottled water and rice balls. Masato sat beside me, his head in his hands. Do you think? He started, but he couldn't finish the question. I knew what he meant. Did we think the town, our homes, would still be standing? Would anyone we knew be among the missing? I don't know, I said honestly, my voice barely audible. As the first light of dawn broke over the hills, the full scope of the devastation came into view. From our vantage point, we could see the once vibrant town of Miyamae reduced to a muddy expanse of debris. Cars lay overturned, roofs floated aimlessly in pools of murky water, and power lines dangled like broken spiderwebs. The silence among the evacuees was deafening. People stared, some in shock, others with tears streaming silently down their faces. "I need to go down there," a man near me said, standing abruptly. He looked to be in his 50s, his face weathered and lined. "My wife, she was at the market. I need to see if she's—" "Wait," a volunteer said, stepping in front of him. "It's too dangerous. The water's still receding, and there's debris everywhere. Please stay here." The man slumped back to the ground, his resolve crumbling. Later that morning, we received instructions from rescue workers who had started arriving in the area. They were organizing search efforts and setting up temporary shelters. The gymnasium was now overflowing, and many of us had to move into makeshift tents set up on the school grounds. Misato and I stayed close, helping where we could. We knew we couldn't just sit idly by while people were in need. We helped comfort children who were separated from their parents, assisted the elderly, and distributed supplies as more arrived. By the afternoon, I felt the overwhelming urge to search for my parents. They lived in a small house closer to the coastline, and I hadn't been able to reach them since the quake. My phone had no signal, and the lines for the satellite phones the rescue teams brought in stretched for hours. Misato noticed my unease. "Aiko, I can come with you," he offered. "But we need to be smart about this. Let's wait until the rescue workers give the all-clear to search." I nodded, though every fiber of my being wanted to sprint down the hill and start digging through the wreckage myself. That evening, I overheard a group of rescue workers talking about the worst-hit areas. They spoke in hushed tones, but their words carried the weight of tragedy. "The lower neighborhoods are completely gone," one of them said. "There's hardly anything left standing. It's going to take weeks, months, to even begin to clear it all." Another worker shook his head. "And the people, so many still missing. We've got reports of entire families unaccounted for." The words made my stomach churn. I thought of my parents, my neighbors, my students and their families. The following morning, Misato and I joined a small group of volunteers heading into the town to assist with the search efforts. I wore a mask to block out the stench of mud and seawater and gloves to protect my hands as we sifted through the debris. Walking through what was left of Miyamae was like stepping into a nightmare. The streets I had walked every day were unrecognizable, buried under piles of rubble and twisted metal. I spotted fragments of familiar places, a piece of the playground equipment from my school, the sign from the corner store where I bought my bento, the roof of Mrs. Takahashi's house. At one point, I found a child's shoe, caked in mud but otherwise intact. I stared at it for a long moment, my heart aching with the weight of what it represented. As the days turned into weeks, the rescue efforts became more organized, but the emotional toll was immense. Every day brought news of more losses, more heartbreak. But there were also moments of hope, reunions, small miracles that reminded us of the resilience of the human spirit. I eventually found my parents. They had been rescued from the roof of their house, where they had taken refuge when the water rose. When I saw them at the shelter, I broke down in tears, hugging them tightly as relief washed over me. "We're okay, Aiko," my mother said, her voice trembling. "We're okay." Life after the disaster was a blur of rebuilding and mourning. Miyamae would never be the same, but the community came together in ways I never imagined. People who had lost everything shared what little they had left. Strangers became family, united by the shared experience of surviving the unimaginable. Through it all, I kept teaching. The children needed a sense of normalcy, and so did I. Each day, as I stood in front of my class, I reminded myself that even in the darkest times, there is light to be found. The weeks after the tsunami blurred together, a haze of grief and determination. Rescue efforts gradually shifted to recovery, and Miyamae began the slow, painful process of rebuilding. The shelter, once crowded with desperate evacuees, started to empty as people found temporary housing or moved in with relatives farther inland. But for those of us who stayed, the challenge of starting over loomed large. I spent most mornings volunteering at the relief center, which was set up in a community hall that had miraculously survived the disaster. The hall, now filled with rows of cots and makeshift kitchens, had become a hub for organizing supplies and assigning tasks. Misato worked with a team clearing debris from the streets, a grueling job that required both physical strength and emotional resilience. Every so often, they uncovered something that brought them to a halt, a family photo, a child's toy, or worse, a grim reminder of those who hadn't made it out in time. "It's hard, Aiko," he admitted one evening, his face streaked with dirt and exhaustion. "But I feel like I have to do something. I can't just sit and wait for things to get better." I knew exactly what he meant. My parents had been moved to a small apartment provided by a disaster relief program. It was cramped and bare, but it was dry and safe. I visited them whenever I could, bringing food and checking in on their health. My father, who had always been the stoic one, seemed quieter than usual, his gaze often drifting to the horizon as if searching for something lost. One afternoon, as we sat together drinking tea, he broke his silence. "This town will rebuild, Aiko," he said firmly. "It's what we do. But it will take time and it will take all of us." I nodded, moved by his determination. His words stayed with me, a reminder of the strength we needed to find within ourselves. School resumed in mid-April, though it was far from normal. The building had suffered extensive damage, so classes were held in temporary structures provided by the government. Many of the students had lost their homes, their belongings, and in some cases, family members. My first day back in the classroom was overwhelming. The children's faces were a mix of relief and sadness, their laughter tinged with a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. Miss Kiyama, one of my students, a bright-eyed girl named Hannah, raised her hand. "Is it okay to feel sad even when we're happy to see everyone?" Her question struck me to my core. I knelt beside her desk and said, "Yes, Hannah. It's okay to feel both at the same time. It means you care deeply, and that's a beautiful thing. The community began to rebuild in earnest as summer approached. Fundraisers and donations poured in from across the country, and volunteers from all over Japan arrived to help. Miyamae became a patchwork of construction sites and temporary facilities, a testament to both destruction and hope. Masato and I joined a group focused on restoring the town's cultural landmarks. One of our first projects was the Shirogane Shrine, a small but beloved place of worship that had been nearly swept away. This shrine has stood for over a century, Masato said as we worked to clean the grounds and rebuild the torii gate. If it can survive this, so can we. Despite the progress, not everything was easy. Some families chose not to return, unable to face the trauma of rebuilding their lives in a place so deeply scarred. Others struggled with the emotional toll, their grief manifesting in ways that strained relationships and tested their resilience. One evening, I ran into Mrs. Takahashi, whose house had been one of the first swept away. She had always been a lively woman, known for her humor and generosity. But now, she seemed a shadow of her former self. I feel like I've lost everything, she confided, her voice trembling. But then I think about how lucky I am to be alive. It's a strange thing, isn't it? To feel grateful and broken at the same time. Her words mirrored my own feelings. By autumn, the town had made significant progress. Businesses reopened in temporary locations, and families moved into prefabricated houses provided by the government. Life was far from normal, but it was moving forward. The turning point came during the annual Obon Festival, held that year as a tribute to those we had lost. The festival committee worked tirelessly to ensure it could still take place, even in a scaled-down form. On the night of the festival, lanterns floated down the river in a breathtaking display of light and remembrance. As I watched, surrounded by friends and neighbors, I felt a sense of unity I hadn't experienced before. This town has a long way to go, Masato said, standing beside me. But tonight, it feels like we're on the right path. The tsunami had taken so much from us, but it hadn't taken our will to keep going. Miyamae wasn't just a place, it was a community, a family. And together we would rebuild, not just our homes but our lives. Winter arrived quietly in Miyamae. Snow blanketed the scars of the tsunami, softening the jagged edges of debris piles and lending a surreal beauty to the town. For a moment, it was easy to forget the devastation and focus on what remained. The community's efforts were paying off. Roads were clear, homes rebuilt, and schools reopened. The once dismal shelter now housed a bustling relief center where people gathered for meals, support, and planning sessions. I'd grown close to many of the volunteers, including Akiko, a college student studying urban planning. She had come to Miyamae with a determination to make a difference. I want to help towns like this prepare for the future, she told me one evening, so that when the next disaster comes, they'll have a fighting chance. Her optimism was infectious, and I found myself inspired to think beyond survival. Teaching had become more than a job for me. It was a lifeline. The children, with their boundless resilience, reminded me daily of the importance of hope. One day, Hannah, the same student who had asked about feeling sad and happy, presented me with a drawing. It depicted our town, not as it was but as it could be, bright, bustling, and full of life. This is Miyamae's future, she declared proudly. Tears pricked my eyes as I thanked her. Her vision was one I hadn't dared to imagine but desperately needed to see. By spring, Masato and I found ourselves standing at the top of the hill overlooking the rebuilt town. The Shirogane Shrine, now fully restored, stood as a symbol of the community's resilience. Do you think we'll ever feel normal again? I asked him, breaking the comfortable silence. Maybe not the way we used to, he said thoughtfully. But maybe that's okay. We've changed and so has the town. Maybe normal doesn't matter as much as moving forward. His words stayed with me as we descended the hill, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next. The years that followed were a blur of progress and reflection. The physical scars of the tsunami faded, but the memories lingered, shaping the lives of everyone who had endured it. Miyamae became a testament to the power of community. Its people, once bound by tragedy, were now united by purpose. The town thrived, not despite its history, but because of it. Looking back, I realized that the tsunami didn't just take, it also gave. It stripped away illusions and forced us to see what truly mattered. It tested our strength and revealed our resilience. As I walk through the rebuilt streets of Miyamae, I am reminded of Hannah's drawing and her simple declaration, this is Miyamae's future. And for the first time in years, I can say with confidence, she was right.